Thank you so much for starting that recording. So again, welcome to session 3 of History, Hurdles, and Hope, Building Neighborhoods of Racial Equity, Environmental Justice, and Community Health in the Areas Affected in the Unrest. I wanted to ask if there's anyone who is with us that wasn't able to join us for sessions 1 or 2. And welcome, Shannon. Thank you for being here.
Hello there. Thanks for having me.
All right. I think this is these are continuing folks. So instead of going through all the background, I'm just going to hit on some of the highlights to center us in this work for the day. And I'll start by asking that each of you introduce yourselves in the chat, dropping in your name, your preferred pronouns, and the organization and or neighborhood that you are connected with that's most related to why you're here today. And while you do that, a quick reminder of who are the folks that are going to be leading this session today. Paul Bachnight, urbanist, architectural designer, historian, advocate, committed to transforming our communities for the better. Tabitha Montgomery, someone who I always find a person of insight and inspiration, who is committed to true change in the Powderhorn Park community that she serves and communities throughout the Twin Cities and beyond. And then I'm the executive vice. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Oh, are you just jumping in, Tabitha? I'm sorry.
Oh, no, Christina gave me a little bit of the hand pump.
Oh, lovely. This is what happens when I look at my notes and not people. I don't like it.
Sorry, yeah. I did not mean to distract.
No, it's fine. Okay, good. Nope, my windows are now in better places. Okay. And I'm Mary Margaret Zindran, and I'm with the American Institute of Architects for Minnesota and Minneapolis and St. Paul. And I'll just be teeing things up today and joining you a little bit later. But I wanted to just re-ground all of us in the intentions of this work and that bigger picture. We as the conveners are just entering today with a lot of gratitude for each of you and your willingness to put your time and your energy toward this work and toward this series of workshops. The overall purpose is to help advance a clear and community-centered point of view related to what has impeded and what can help us in accelerating equitable development in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And the learnings from today and the previous 2 sessions are going to inform the questions that we ask of you and of others that members of this group have recommended be engaged in these follow-up interviews. Those inputs will inform a draft change agenda that we will ask you to come together to review with us and shape with us. It is meant to be a multi-sector change agenda, addressing those barriers and bright spots in the work of governments, for-profit businesses, nonprofit organizations, and grant makers, really with a focus on what it is that we're aiming for, which is the best of what's possible in the built environment. We're going to spread the resulting change agenda far and wide. We're going to do so through some community meetings and leveraging a variety of media and hoping to land on communications approaches that inspire others toward the hope, purpose, and action orientation that you all exhibit so well. So with that, I'm going to turn it to Tabitha to outline our core objective for today's session and how we're going to be spending our time.
So just thank you, Mary Margaret, as always, for the kind intro, and thank you to all of you for making time again in your day for this last session of History, Hurdles, and Hope. And I'm going to just kind of tag on to what Mary Margaret has begun with, to say that ultimately our core aim today is to really begin to refine and hone the how we collectively think about how we will support the equitable development, considering some of the context and the information and the discussion that we had from last week, whether it be really taking a new or another look at some of the historical truths of inequity that has plagued systems and structures, and of course have influenced people's behaviors since the start of this, what we will call these United States. And then also thinking about how do we take information, ideas, paradigms, like some of the ideology that Mary Margaret began to share in terms of how do we move away from just satisficing, if you remember that term, in terms of understanding that that's not an optimal state, but being willing in some ways to settle, because the cost of investing in new systems, new institutions, new structures can often seem daunting, and or in truth are daunting, which then preclude us from collectively taking steps to really figure out what is our path forward, as well as we began to shed a little bit of insight, structural insight around this idea of 21st century development, or if you Google it, maybe 21st century design, which is really about, in part, having the right things and systems in place that the community, that people need in order to have the built environment and the community that we desire. And so again, our core goal today is to say, yep, we've talked a lot about a lot. We've spent now close to, it will be at the, as all in said and done, over 6 hours of discussing and thinking and ideating. But then hopefully you leave today with some practical ideas around some of the day-to-day stuff that you already do in terms of how we show up together or when we're apart, in service of centering people, in service of getting the community health and the community tapestry and development that we want. So today, the core objective is all about the how. How do we get there? And not because our how is perfect, not because our how doesn't have opportunity, not because even in the process that Mary Margaret outlined, that the how will not morph through more community input, more wisdom from crowdsourcing, but because it will create, I think, a basis for how we begin to really consider where do we put in the energy for us to work together for a different outcome and impact in our community when it comes to development. So that is the core objective. Thank you again for your time. It's all about the how. So we look forward to furthering this conversation with Paul jumping in and helping us to get centered in that discussion. Go for it, Paul.
Thank you, Tabitha. Good afternoon, everybody. Hope your Monday is going well. It's getting to be halfway through, so I'm more awake now. Had some coffee, and so I appreciate everybody being here. So I'm not gonna get deep into continuing history today. I want to talk a little bit though about, Tabitha mentioned the how, and that's really important. And I always though like to talk about history because if you want to get to the how, you need to understand the why, right? So my earlier discussions was really about, okay, if we want to understand how these systems of oppression have worked and how dehumanizing, BIPOC individuals in the quest for power and wealth and land use happened, and what's that thread and how does that still impact what goes on today, we needed to understand some of that why. So as we continue to do this work, and as a lot of us who are working in different sectors and systems, understanding what those relationships are, what that history means, how we got here, and then ultimately how are we going to change this, right? And so for me, that's really important, and also to look at then opportunities where people are thinking about this work from a historical perspective, understanding their community, what's gone on, how did we get here, what do we want to change, and then how do we do that in a much bigger context, right? Not just from healing the wounds of the physical, because we can all go out and heal the physical scars. You know, that is something, and that's easy to see, easy to define. I get in trouble at this at work, but I say it all the time, easy to do that, but much harder to do this healing work that, you know, is about people's trauma, their emotions, how they see their community, how they interact with it, whether or not they have the ability, as Tabitha said earlier in our conversation this morning, just to pay the rent, to feel safe when you walk out the door, you know, to go on vacation, you know, all that work is much more difficult. But that's the landscape that we work in when we talk about the built environment. You know, it doesn't exist, you know, in a silo. It exists in this social, cultural, economic, political landscape, you know, that is operating all the time, right? And that we dip in and out of, and some of us may be further in some pieces than the others. You know, you may not be as big a policy wonk as I am. You know, you may be more, you know, you may be thinking more about the environmental side, you may be thinking more about the housing side, but all this is coming together and it's driving what we see ultimately. And a lot of times we don't think about that. We just think, oh, we see that, right? And you know, in community, we're like, well, why did that happen over there? Like, why is that building, or why did that get built there? Why did they do that? Well, it's connected to a much broader set of circumstances and reality. So if you're on Plymouth Avenue and you don't understand why there's, you know, 8 blocks of Section 8 housing that was developed in the 1970s after the unrest, it makes it harder to do other work and to think about, well, what do we want? Because people will say all the time, well, this is what I want to see. Well, context is really important. So with that, I want to move to this slide. Angie, if you could pull that up. Great. So this is from, you know, this is my wife actually gave me a bookmarker that said book nerd for Christmas because I love to read and I love to do this work. So this is from a book called Cities for Life, How Communities Can Recover from Trauma and Rebuild for Health. And it's really thinking about an ecological model as a framework for urban health and equity. And it's related to those of you who, think about the, social determinants of health. But what it's really talking about is how do we combine, how do we work across social values, institutions, living and working conditions, to get real change. As opposed to, I think sometimes where we think about how do we create physical structures to get real change. So you'll see on the one side, we've got social values, inclusion, exclusion, race, ethnicity, religion, gender, sexual orientation, transparency of public decision-making, which is really important. Lots of times by the time in community we hear about, well, what the direction is, it's been talked about for a long time. Human rights, wealth redistribution, reparative and restorative justice. So all of these, social values, institutions, public policy, laws, regulations and norms, regulation of private markets and corporations. And we do have to remember that, we talk about a free market, but the market is constrained and controlled. I mean, we had the Federal Reserve who during, COVID, reduced, the interest rate to zero in order to keep the economy, going. And now there's all this concern about inflation and do we need to, increase, the interest rates to tamp down on, what we're seeing in the marketplace. So it's not that, government doesn't have the power to interfere in the market, because what we see and what we saw in the history is that they do all the time. Civil society organizations and social movements, mutual aid and philanthropy, living and working conditions. So land use, transportation, housing, residential segregation, exposure to toxins, retail, business parks, food security, climate change, safe jobs and quality wages. So the example I gave the other day about the Rise Commons and that work came out of this book. And Richmond, California, where that project exists, that the young people, you know, designed and dreamed and are doing, it's all part of a much larger healing agenda around, you know, what was going on in Richmond. And so, you know, you had disinvestment, you had segregation, you had poor quality housing, you had high violence, you know, lots of homicides. You know, you had school, you know, there's a lot of immigrant population. So, you know, ICE, all of this is going on, right? And so the project I showed you was part of a larger attempt to work across that and to heal people in the community. So the youth piece was only one part. When you look at the book and you read it, you'll see the work they did around education, the work they did around crime, the work, how the police were viewing young people, how the police were interacting with other people in the community, how they were dealing with housing. So this whole healing model of really saying, okay, like all of this has to come together to have the kind of communities that we want and to address these inequities is really important. Sorry. So to me, those are, when I look at this model and I think about health, I'm like, this is where we get to the healing piece. This is where we think we start talking about things that are beyond bricks and mortar but that drive bricks and mortar. We don't usually connect those, and we tend to separate those, right? Even though we know your zip code, you know, says what your life trajectory, you know, may be, just based on your zip code, not based on your innate ability as a human to, you know, have dominion over your life. All these systems that are in place are not in place or impacting you negatively or whatever. And your zip code really has a lot to say about what happens. So if we don't connect those things and understand too how they are part of historical systems and inequities, we're not going to get to this where we want to go. And so to me, the how is based on understanding that and also looking at these new systems and approaches to do the work.
Was that the pause, Paul?
That is the pause. That is the pause, dear.
All right. So really with that, I'm really hoping that everyone can help us to ideate, right, around what does healing look like to you in community? How would that show up? So if as a part of the how work, one of the things that we're proposing or postulating is that in order to even to begin centering people, let's first deal in concrete terms and ways with harm that has been advanced through existing institution systems, policies, and so forth and so on, things that Paul spoke to last week. So for you, and again, feel free to come off chat or come off mute or drop it into the chat. What are one thing or more than one thing that you can imagine that would show up in terms of us as a community beginning to see inroads toward healing from past experiences and traumas that have been that has unfolded in our community?
I guess I want to mention about this program that I was a part of last summer. And it was a program hosted by One to One, and it was a community-centered consensus workshop program where young adults would come together and share about how they saw, felt, imagined what a safe community would look like. And this program started after George Floyd got murdered. So, and we got in the program got hired to rewrite a social justice curriculum for Hennepin Tech. So it was for the organization to gather data on what the community, young Black and brown folks said. You know, it's because what they want, what they say, what they feel, that they went ahead and worked with Hennepin Tech. I didn't get a chance to be there because I got fired. But that was because I just stood up for, you know, having cops in the room where we were bringing the youth from North and South, that they were sharing their experience with social justice officers, and how that was going to actually add to people's trauma and me not being okay with having guns in the room. But that was an awesome program that I felt helped a lot of people heal, or on the path to healing for sure.
Well, thank you, Gladys, for sharing that on a couple of different fronts. You're always being able to share some of your personal story with us, that you feel like that this is a safe space to do that. So thank you. Want to try to help hold that to the degree that we can. And also just this idea that creating space, right, as a form of healing for voices that for all intents and purposes, we have seen not be treated often with as much or needed respect, or really trying to cultivate and create solutions and programs based on what a group would propose. So in this particular case, I'm hearing Gladys lift up that not only were they young people, but they were people of color, young people who were helping to give dimension and texture to what was needed in their communities from their lens, which again, I think is again a powerful example of what does healing look like. So creating space for other ideas that are not often either supported or room is created for, and then actually designing program around what was said and not what you wanted to do originally. Any other thoughts about what does healing look like in our community to deal with in systems, policies, again, that for too long have left a lot of people out and or abused people for who they are? And again, you don't have to share off mute, but if there's some ideas that you have in the chat, please feel free to drop them in. And I didn't do this last week, and this isn't necessarily a threat, but I don't mind calling on people. You know, it's Monday. I know we got to warm up. You know what I mean? But I know that there's a lot of good ideas in the room. You know, I know Christina, as a PP&A employee, would not find it, you know, too much of a hardship to share an idea or two about what healing might look like. And I tease, but because I know a lot of the work you're too connected to, Christina, and even your career and past experience in education. So what comes up for you?
Gosh, the first thing I was thinking about when you asked this question, Tabitha, was not something that I've actually fleshed out. It's not something I had been thinking about before, which I think is maybe good. So just to be vulnerable and share that idea, it was like, I'd love to see, like we have at PP&A, a more diverse staff and, you know, kind of all the way down. So yeah, as a principal, as a executive director of nonprofit, like, yeah, making room for multiple viewpoints at every level seems like working from the inside out. So I can just see that as being a really generative, creating the social circumstances where we get to listen to each other and learn from each other. And yeah, a little more listening, a little more sitting back for people like me. And I'm really happy to go right after Gladys because, you know, it fits together with, I think, what she shared.
Yeah, I would agree. So creating space and knowing when and to support this idea of, do we have, I think that's a great point, Christina, is healing. Do we see healing when we see more people with diverse backgrounds, cultural diversity, disability diversity, life experience diversity, or sexual identity diversity, having opportunities to really lead and to foster what should take place in the community. And I think that is, I've seen a form of how the community, I think, feels connected and strong when all the people that are there feel seen and supported and being able to engage in community and really on their terms is what I would say. So again, if there's other thoughts, please, you're welcome to share them. I invite you to, or you can drop them in the chat. If not, we're just gonna keep moving on here, and I'm gonna turn it back to Paul. But again, we can always come back to any one of these as time permits, some of these questions that are being put before you. So again, let's keep in mind our whole focus today in day 3 of our last workshop together is how do we get this done? How do we center people in development? And the first premise, right, that just as if you're taking shorthand that we're putting forward is that we need to heal so that we don't get caught up in the cycle of doing business as usual or doing things for the purposes of what I would call proclamations and statements that we're willing to put out that are not followed by action. Gretchen?
So I'll just throw out some quick thoughts. I don't know if it's helpful or not. The process of healing has many dimensions. I would just say, to me, it means a lot about rebuilding trust. And so that is very relational and process based. And I know that the work that Liska's been doing has been very intentionally shifting our culture around more community-centered decision processes. So, to the extent that we have access to resources, how do we engage the communities to be the arbiters of how those resources are deployed? And so that's been kind of a key facet of reorienting or emphasizing that. I think that always has been a dimension, but it's been very intentional and very kind of the front end of thinking about how to do that. So I would just throw out that community-centered decision processes. And it's really fascinating how that works, because while community-centered processes, there's also kind of power broker processes too. So these processes kind of exist at the same time. So how do they intersect, or do they inform each other? Or because each brings an important lens for what change looks like. So I'll just leave it there.
Gretchen, I think that was great. And not to go full on sci-fi on everybody, but I think what you just lifted up was like the last season of The Expanse that I'm a little bit addicted to. If anybody is looking for a show recommendation on Amazon Prime, you're welcome, because it's that good. But anyway, there was 3 factions, right? And it was kind of like what they were called the Inners, the Belters, and the Martians. And not that you need to really understand that, but one of the things, one of the groups had been so marginalized, but then the 2 other groups were trying to convince them to believe that, hey, we're going to now do this together. We're going to come and everybody gets an equal vote. And their point was, how do you want to build trust with me if we're still in the margins, right? So you will still outvote, right? With your 2 to 1, you will still be in the driver's seat. So what you just lifted up in terms of building trust will cost the people who have always had the positional power something in order to help get people to believe that trust and partnership is something more than in name only. So I think that was great. The Expanse, check it out. Shanae, your hand is up.
Hey everyone. So I think about healing a lot in my field of work. And I think oftentimes that word is thrown around a lot without the really intentional conversations about what are we healing from? And being very explicit about what is it? And I think it begins, like you all have begun, with that history, right? But oftentimes when we rush to healing, and really like not give much thought into like what it actually takes. I think we come up with solutions, but then it doesn't really, the people most impacted by what needed to be healed from isn't actually reached. And so I'm like, you know, coming off the murder of George Floyd, what I've learned is that lots of people were rushing to healing. And then ultimately what has happened is that the people most impacted aren't like reaping the benefits of all of this healing talk. And so I think that that's critical. Like, what are we healing for? And specifically, what is the community asking for when they say healing? And not some like theoretical, but like really practical stuff. I've learned through mutual aid and things like that is people just need the money, right? And people need easy access to it and to do the things that they need to do with it, right? And so how can we make this process so that there's not a whole bunch of red tape to accessing what we need for true healing? And that it does, I'm gonna continue to scream this from the hills, that it just doesn't go to the selective few that are present during meetings or that have given their input or have been invited to committees and things like that, but it's, you may have to do some work to find the people and maybe do some meetings at late night so that people have access to the information and can be an integral part of the solution and not just on surface or like me representing the entire community. Because although I'm very immersed in my community, I know that I am not the representative. So that's my thinking. That's my take. I'm sticking with it.
Love it. Until we, what, you trying to say that until we try to force you to not have that position? Is that what you're saying? No, I love that, Shanae. And the truth, the part of the truth for me, and then Alicia, I'm going to come to you next, is that what you name in terms of how we use language, sometimes loosely, cavalierly, can actually get in the way of some of the change work, which we're going to get to in a little bit here in this session, that is really needed, which is oftentimes the type of energy and decisions that we need to see are significant. And what I mean by that is, at some point, maybe Shanae is a part of the, how do we develop as a part of our change agenda, language to our philanthropic partners around, we are no longer able to just provide direct payment or benefit to nonprofits, but so much of the well-being and equity can be linked to people's average median income and not being able to secure the things that they need in order to exist in the communities that they've chosen well, right? And so then what does that look like? Because we certainly, as an organization, saw the value and the benefit of when we, through our renter support fund, was able to walk alongside people, even pre-pandemic, with direct cash assistance and acknowledgement of that the ends don't always help meet, right, for all the expenses that people have. So that's just, again, not trying to solve it, but to say sometimes the bigger change really reflects us needing to do things materially different in order to begin to see those outcomes in our community take hold for more people. So removing the red tape and not just going through nonprofits. We don't have a collective history of thinking that that's, as a society, what we should do, right? As opposed to, but that's what we need to do, right? There's a lot of shoulding that happens that shuts down our ability to accelerate change. Oh, we shouldn't do that, but we need to do that because we're playing from such a deficit in communities most often. Alicia.
Thanks. Great. Oops. I'm off mute. Great comments so far. You know, I would just add that I think our faith communities have a role to play in this as well. They offer a place for people to share their hurt and offer paths to heal through, you know, different practices and rituals and beliefs and prayers, you know, whatever your faith may be. I was a part of an interfaith collective where these different leaders came together after the murder of George Floyd, and every day it was a different person offering, you know, a word of inspiration or a devotion, but people were able to come together across faith and to be able to to name it and to acknowledge it and to start, figuring out ways to heal. And some of these institutions are so embedded in our communities and, really find purpose in environmental stewardship as well as social justice. So I think, having those organizations be a part of the solution are part of the how. And, and I think, you can learn from different belief systems, whatever they are. So.
Wonderful. So again, so we don't always get lost because we end up saying a lot, but just again, the framing was, how do we see health and us contributing to healing in our communities? And there was a lot of great things that came up. So we started with Gladys's comments around, part of creating space for young people, specifically BIPOC young folks, to really determine and name what they need in community and design around that. Really looking at the value of institutions, organizations, and groups being led with diverse people, so that is woven throughout the way the work happens and who's deciding the work. Understanding that we probably got way too much red tape out here in the world, so that we don't really want to talk about what are we needing to heal from, which is Shanae's point, which is, centuries of harm that has been perpetuated through systems and institutions and policies. And then, not lastly, certainly, but then what Alicia offers up is institutions, religious institutions in particular, but interfaith, I heard as being a part of that, not just one faith, not just one faith tradition, having a role to play in how you help people to hold what they feel that they've experienced, so that they feel heard as a step in the healing process. So a lot of good ideas. I'm sure there's more. Drop them in the chat if you feel so inclined to share, or we can come back to this when we get to our next kind of share out. But I'm going to turn it back over to Paul, if you guys don't mind, for us to go into kind of our next movement. But thank you.
Thank you, everybody, and some really good comments that really play into this next piece, which is about people, policies, and projects. How do we center community voices? But I want to just take a little pivot there. And one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is resilience, right? And we talk about resilience a lot. And, BIPOC communities and individuals are like the most resilient people on the planet, because we couldn't have survived genocide, the taking of indigenous lands, slavery, Jim Crow, et cetera, without being resilient. But a lot of times, we don't really think about, why do we have to be resilient to those things? Because it's those systems that are making us have to be that strong to survive this situation. And I want to get to the point where, my resiliency is not determined by other people and other forces and how I operate, right? So I've been processing that a lot, because there's a lot of times too where we, that strength sometimes doesn't allow us to be really in the moment, honest and frank about where our pain is. And we may not say what needs to be said, at the proper time. So that's my own thought process I'm going through right now, thinking about how we do this work. But if we get back to, a lot of things that were discussed, centering community voice, and it's like Tabitha said, if we're going to really talk about co-creation, that's a power dynamic. And the folks who are in power have to give up power to truly have this work done in a way that community is the driver. So we have lots of processes where people are saying we're doing co-creation, but we don't do that. We don't change those power dynamics. And so the whatever Martian group or whatever the group was Tabitha was talking about, because I don't watch that sci-fi, but I like sci-fi, so I'm gonna have to check it out. Are coming to the table, right, saying, hey, we want to work with you, but we're still in charge, right? That's not how it works. You can't get to where we want to go if that's where we start. And there has to be a real determination that, yes, we are going to give up power in order to get to a better outcome, which is extremely difficult when you've been in charge to say that, and then to actually operationalize it, because it means changing the culture and the systems within your own organizations, institutions, whatever is going on, in order to do that work in a way that's going to make a difference. I like to think about this, and Shanae said something like, we need to think about how we design a better now and how we design a better future. But we have to be working on those at the same time, because you're right. Sometimes it's like, we just need to do this now, right? Right? We need money, we need this, we need that. Okay, and we need to make sure that happens, because if we don't do that, then folks who we would like to be in the room when we're centering power may not be able to attend. So we need to think about the now, and then we need to think about, well, what's this long-term trajectory that we need to work on, and not get only caught up in the current realities, right? Because it's going to take time to do the work. So we have to do both, and it's always hard to work on both. So everyone has to skip lunch some days and stay up late in order to get the work done, right? Don't skip lunch every day. It's not good. But occasionally, you might have to skip lunch and you got to stay up late in order to get this work done. Leadership is critical in this work. And also, one of the things is looking at who's doing it and where's leverage. I truly believe that, in order to get to the kind of change that we want to see, not only locally, we're going to have to think about how this exists nationally. And so there are a lot of people doing a lot of different things, having very similar conversations that we are. I lifted up some of those examples over the last couple sessions. But how do we leverage all that work in a way that drives it much further from a national perspective, a state perspective, a local perspective? How do we get the synergies and the strengths that come from lots of other people? So if we think about it, right, the murder of George Floyd caused this reckoning on race across the world, not just in Minneapolis, but across the whole world. So there are all these people who are saying, okay, we have to make this change. We don't have the same level of change and push for that kind of change for the capitalist system, for how we do development. How do we, leverage all of that? Because, the revolution is going to have to be national in order for it to then get to local, right? And it's got to go both ways in order to do that work. So one of the initiatives that I'm involved in one of my other hats that I wear at the Minneapolis Parks Foundation, is an organization called Reimagining the Civic Commons. Reimagining the Civic Commons basically says we can make social and economic change in communities, challenge segregation, mistrust, etc., by leveraging public spaces, whether that be parks, libraries, schools, the public realm. But we need to think of them not just from their physical perspective, but from how one is, they're places that people come together, they're ways to connect people of different races, ethnicities, faiths, etc., from a social economic mixing thing. But they're also really a lot of times, significant drivers. I mean, if we think of Minneapolis, we have this incredible park system, #3 nationally. We've been #1. There are people having a lot of angst because we're #3 behind St. Paul, which is #2, but we'll leave that alone. But the question is not,
I think we just might be having some technical difficulties. I don't think Paul is rolling his eyes at us, so we're just going to give that a minute.
It's the people from St. Paul that just cut him out.
It was a cliffhanger too.
I was up at St. Paul,
where did we get stuck?
Well, we felt like, because once you started throwing shade at St. Paul, we was trying to make a connection. Trying to make a connection about your connection. So why don't you
That
keep,
was hilarious
why
because
don't
I
you
also
keep it
throw shade at
clean
St. Paul.
on our St. Paul folks, Paul? And we
I
don't.
wasn't throwing shade at St. Paul. I was throwing shade at Minneapolis. That people in Minneapolis are having an issue because St. Paul is number 2.
Okay,
That's the reality.
all right.
All
Well,
right.
the city guys was confused, so let's just be a little bit tighter in our language. Go
A
for it.
safe space. If, if there's shade to throw at Minneapolis, it's okay. Okay. Back to how wonderful our partners in St. Paul are and how wonderful Minneapolis is. So anyway, how do we take these great park spaces in the public realm, use it in a way that's not just about you go there, but to connect people, to challenge systems, to make change that extends past just the use. And how do we do that? By thinking about it across 10 cities, because Reimagining is a 10-city learning network. And I'm not going to remember all 10 cities, so y'all can Google it, look it up, get the 10 cities, right? I'm not going to remember all 10. But it's really about those 10 cities are all bringing how they do this work, how they're doing change differently, and then how do we all benefit? And then how do we extend that? And a lot of the things that we were just talking about in this work, we just published this place driving equity report where we talk about, shared prosperity, building trust, which is critical, and Gretchen is right on it. Relationships are the reality. So, if I can't get the trust if I don't have any relationships with you. And a lot of times people come into the community and they think, why don't you trust me? I'm like, I have no reason to, right? And particularly if you're representing oppressive systems and institutions, why do you think you automatically get trust? And you may be the greatest person on the planet, but hey, it's going to take time. So this relational piece is really important. How we come together and how it's about more than the project. And so some examples of this work are, Rebuild Foundation in Chicago, that's the Astor Gates, but that whole idea of, the work on the South Side, centering Black space and Black joy. There's some great work in Philadelphia around how do we have residents drive programming and staffing and how we think about our parks. So that's really centering community voices at the table to do this work. And then just broadly, the connection to, all the things that I think we've been touching on: workforce, entrepreneurship, capital flows. How does philanthropy and private capital come together in more of in an integrated system to deliver change, as opposed to the separateness that we have right now? How do we think about procurement? All of those things are operating when we think about the work we do in the public sector and in these kind of spaces. So it's a real place strategy. And when we're talking about development, we're always talking about place. So where human, social, spiritual, cultural, political systems and physicality come together, is this nexus of that work, whether it's in St. Paul or Minneapolis, and how we can hold that up. So what I like about the report, and you can look at it, is there's some real concrete examples, and it's great for practitioners to say, hey, there's about, I don't know, 7 or 8 case studies, I don't remember, in the report that you can read and look and say, oh, this is how they did this in Detroit, or this is how they did this in Philly, this is how they did this in Akron, Ohio, this is how they did this, wherever those other places are. And it also gets to the bottom line. A lot of these are around how do we do change. So here, our driver is, if we can get the adoption of this idea that civic spaces are about social and economic change, and the park board says, yes, we buy into that, then that's a citywide impact in terms of how we see this work. And it gets to all the drivers of equity, all of those other things. So for me, it's a really good example of this idea that you know, we can connect with people, we can do this work, we can center them from a perspective that we're maybe not thinking about, because most people take parks for granted, to be honest. You know, particularly here because it's great. Parks are great here everywhere. So we take them for granted, but they could be much stronger, and usually they're not controversial, you know, so to speak. Yeah, I have to think about that. Are they? So in that vein, though, as we think about, you know, our city, you know, we had the whole struggle with homelessness in the park, right? And that was a huge issue in the city last year. I think the park board was like, yes, we should think about what that is. I think their struggle was they weren't equipped and they didn't understand, well, who else do we need to be connected to make that change? And so then the reaction has been, well, you know, we just don't deal with that, as opposed to, no, what's our role? How do we leverage the fact that we own a lot of land? And, you know, could housing be built on some park land? Because the park board owns more land in the city than anyone. Biggest landholder in the city is the park board. So could any land go for housing for the homeless? Is that something we should talk about? How do we center the voices of homeless people in that discussion around how do we get to that change? Not just from our perspective of what we should do. So for me, that gets to who's at the table, the power structure. Park board is political, elected officials, leadership. What does it look like, and how do we make that change?
Awesome. Thanks, Paul. So now I'm going to share a poll, our only poll of the day, and it's a bit wordy, so I'm just preparing you, and apologies, just didn't have great ways to kind of synthesize all of these amazing ideas that are coming forward. But really, the question will center when you see it around, what can you do? So I'm going to ask that you really center yourself in the question. What are things that you think that you can do or would even consider, right, is maybe another way to think about it, to help us as a collective, as a community, as society, move toward more of a people-centered way of approaching our built environment and what the community needs, versus what often can feel like more of a transactionally centered or profit-driven reason for why things come into existence within our community. So I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll. Why don't you please go ahead and take just a minute to kind of read through it, make your selections. And this is multiple choice this time, guys, so you can choose up to 3 is what I asked for, just so we can see maybe which ones pop to the top. But really thinking about what might help us to really not just accelerate, but for you personally, help to make an impact moving away from more transactionally centered development in our community to more people-centered development. And apologies, I don't have any Jeopardy type music to help fill the space, but just imagine that you hear it. All right, responses are coming in. I appreciate everyone taking a moment to cast your vote, if you will. If you could go ahead and take another 20 seconds. We'll wrap this up and keep moving. All right, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Thank you for playing. I'm going to go ahead and share the results. So, you know, again, sometimes there's a lot of synergy in this group, it feels like, but some of the ones that pop to the top in terms of the one with the most number of support, 15 out of 19 of those who were able to respond. So prioritizing collaborations, that I think my question got cut off, but prioritizing collaborations and partnerships within your sector to further and deepen positive community outcomes. Another one that received a lot of support is intentionally spending your money and investing in people, businesses, and organizations led by BIPOC folks. And then the third was to champion ways we focus on people and environment over economic systems. And again, the others also had, I would say, a decent number of support across the board. But again, I think that this is, again, us really trying to tangibly think through what does that look like? So when we say language, create new terminology, or existing but very not commonly heard of terminology like satisficing, how do we not become satisfied that the systems that we have that don't seem to center and optimize outcomes for people, that we sometimes do so much more to protect the system as opposed to the people? How do we begin to get our arms around that and unravel that? Appreciate, Russ, the comment you dropped in the chat, wanting if there was outside of an other and all of the above. And then the appreciation of that is that we also understand and are humbled by the fact that our lives are such, at least right now, that as we're trying to unravel that which is, we don't always have all the time to do all the things. But I think that this is an encouragement for us to begin to think through what are one or two things that you can do as an individual, as a part of your organization, within your own household, to begin for us to create more ripple effects that helps to drive toward the vision of community that we want. And that's not to say that a lot more coordination amongst us on our shared agenda won't be needed, but I do think that that's a part of it, meaning our individual disruption as well as our collective action taken together, I think can really begin to reflect the communities that we are all hungry for. So I think a few people, okay, so Alicia had to drop out. Missed an opportunity to thank her for being with us. Are there any people who wanted to share a little context to the way that you responded to that particular question, or add a little bit more color in terms of what you're thinking about? How do we move from transactionally centered outcomes to more people-centered outcomes? Otherwise, I'm going to toss it back to Paul and we'll keep going.
Tabitha, this is Kara.
Hey, Kara.
Can I jump in?
Of course, please.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Tabitha, and everyone that's pulling this together. I just wanted to jump in. I said on the first night that I think there are two community groups, one on the north side and one here in south side, juxtaposition, and then also the Cultural Wellness Center here on the south side that have been African-American led, doing amazing healing, community, economic development work that I think that we can, I think it's important to lift up organizations and groups of people that that really are, I think, recognized authorities over how to do this work and sustainable work. So one thing that I guess I would say, I'm with the Cultural Wellness Center, and one of the things that I'm a part of co-creating right now is a cultural investment council that is focusing specifically on a 3-mile radius from 38th in Chicago. This 3-mile radius was before the murder of George Floyd. Just want to say that, and it's along the 38th Street corridor. So the Cultural Investment Council is focusing on sustainability for the Cultural Wellness Center. As some of you might know, Elder Atum Azahir is 78, and she's the elder of that group. And so we want the work to continue beyond her, as you know, I think she'll be around forever, at least I hope. But so anybody that's interested in being a part of a cultural investment council, I'm heading up the one for people of European heritage to continue. We're focusing on the Dreamland on 38th Street. So the Cultural Wellness Center is starting a campaign and is going to be developing right across from the Sabathani Center. And we're doing things around home ownership for Black and BIPOC, Black and Indigenous families particularly. So again, my name's Kara Carlson. I'm with, I have a business here, Anamkara Therapies in Powderhorn Park, and I'm part of the Cultural Wellness Center and the Cultural Investment Council. So that would be a way that people, if they want to be building collaborative or partnerships or economically contributing within a 3-mile radius to those endeavors, please reach out to me.
Wonderful. Cara, thank you for sharing. And I do think that that's powerful. That's a real practical example of what people might consider, given the way that you, many of you responded to the prior poll question. Christina, I see your hand raised. Did you want to share?
I have a question, just a quick question for Kara. You said that you were heading up, I think, the European centered circle within this Cultural Investment Council. Is that right? And then
Yeah.
are there others, or how is that structure? Because that seems important to note because of what we're talking about, the how, I guess.
Yeah, so following the philosophy of community and the people's theory of sickness of the Cultural Wellness Center, we are, Anamkara, we're a community of people primarily of European heritage that have been studying ourselves from a cultural ground, moving from a race mentality to a culture mentality. And again, following the leadership of the African-American elders of the Cultural Wellness Center, one of the things we started talking about is how do we invest as neighbors within the community, European Americans, how do we invest in our neighborhood that we love here to really benefit, so that we can keep the diversity, we can keep the beauty, the dynamism of culture. So we're just one of the cultural councils that have been being formed. So there's other, we could reach out to the Cultural Wellness Center, Robert Taylor, who's doing a lot of the work of this work around the councils and fundraising and economic justice kind of ventures that we're studying, which is really in alignment with what you've been talking about, Paul. So it's hyper local, and I just want to bring that up, lift that forward. I hope that answered your question, Christina.
And we can also help people get in contact with any principal, Cara included, that's connected with the Cultural Wellness Center after this particular workshop, if there's interest. And I also want to name that, the intentionality, right, around not just a group coming together to invest, but being willing to learn from those who have been most directly negatively impacted around what systems of divestment, strategic divestment, has been perpetuated in communities, Brown, Black communities, from the beginning. So I think that there's a lot probably there that many of us can learn and to continue to support and to build from as your interest and inclination drives you. So with that, if there's not another comment in that particular regard, I encourage everyone to continue to use the chat. Is that Mary Margaret, are you coming off because you?
I was thinking I would just note, and I was shifting gears to put it in the chat, but Shanae, I just wasn't sure if that was a hand from before. I had assumed it was, but just wanted to double check.
Yes.
Yes, it was. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Thanks. Thanks, Mary Margaret. All right, Paul, back to you.
Okay, we're actually moving into this pathways to accelerate hope, and we're going to talk about systems change, which we've been talking about, but Mary Margaret is going to lead us through some systems change efforts, and then we're going to get to some projects that are really doing that work. So Mary Margaret.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks for putting these slides up, Angie. All right, so today's focused on the how, and one of the ways that we've been thinking about the how of systems change, of culture change, is really digging back into the theory of systems change, and architects are trained to think in terms of systems thinking, but it's stuff that is very applicable to the rest of us and how we think about systems, how they operate, and how they can be changed. So just wanted to share this as context, and then turning it back to Paul to kind of make some connections to how he's seen this show up in some great examples. And forgive me, I am needing to make this slide just a little bit bigger to see it myself. So if you're not familiar with systems thinking, or it's been a while since you've spent some time with it, it is an overall sort of philosophy and approach. It's also a tool for analyzing a situation that you want to change. And it's a way of sort of seeing the world. And, for each of these little segments of this illustration, the right side of it, the right side of the pear, is something that is true about systems thinking. It focuses on the interconnections, the interconnectedness of who we are as people, how our systems operate, and then the solutions also need to be interconnected in nature. It's less linear, step one, step two, step three, and more circular in how systems actually operate, how they feed each other, different aspects of the system. The idea that instead of operating within silos, there's a coming together and an emergence of what can be by bringing different aspects of the system together. It's holistic in nature, as opposed to focusing on just one piece of the puzzle. It's about synthesizing and bringing together a variety of understandings and perspectives, as opposed to analysis paralysis. And it is, at the end of the day, about relationships, very much to what Paul and Tabitha have spoken to today. The how is very much rooted in relationship. The other thing that I really am inspired by with systems thinking is the idea that it's courageous, that it leads you to places, to ideas, to solutions and actions that are impolitic, that can get you in trouble a little bit, because it causes you to ask foundational questions and unusual questions, because you're, again, not looking at the parts, but you're looking at the whole, and you're rooting in relationship. Next slide. So under that big umbrella of systems thinking is something called leverage points analysis. And it's really kind of categorizing the different aspects of a system and figuring out what are the areas where if you put a small degree of effort in, you make a small change, it has a big outcome. It has an outsized impact in changing the system. And I'm not going to go through every element of, I'm not going to go through each leverage point. I'll put a link in the chat that explains it in great detail. But the leverage points that have that outsized impact are pretty intuitive. They're pretty easy to understand. It's just not where we tend to put our efforts in changing systems. We tend to focus on the kinds of changes that are closer to that fulcrum as opposed to further out on the lever. So the things to focus on in having that outsized impact are things that you all have talked about in these couple of sessions, like information flows. Who has access to what information at what times in the process? We talked about information hoarding, resource hoarding, and the damage that that can cause, as opposed to transparency and, as opposed to sequentially, we're going to engage the community, at the very beginning, then we're going to go silent for months and months and months and months, and then we're going to engage them again, as opposed to, what is that constant flow of information and access to it and ability to influence it. The rules of the system are about what gets rewarded and what gets punished. I'm thinking back to what was mentioned earlier about the whole process of navigating the red tape and the regulations and the paperwork. There are folks who are able to navigate that system because they understand the rules that have been set up, and they have found ways to be rewarded for the way that they navigate that system. If you're not familiar with the rules, or the way that you respond to those rules goes against the people who've created them, it's hard to make your way through. So changing the rules, changing those barriers to entry, and what behaviors or what ideas get rewarded is a way to change the system in very significant ways. Key here is power. And, Paul has talked about this, Tabitha as well, a number of you. Who has the power to change what aspects of the system? And in particular, to change in the moment? Who has discretionary authority to spend dollars, to say okay to an idea and lift it up and move it forward? Because if you're working with someone who doesn't have the power to change those rules, you get a little stuck, right? But if there is greater ability for people to respond to a situation based on broad values and goals, there's more room to move, more opportunity for change to occur. The goals of the system are, further along that continuum, even more important in being able to change the system. And here it's not about those surface level goals, to what Tabitha said earlier, those statements and proclamations. It's really, what are the real goals of the system? The ones where you look at how it operates and you can see what its goals are. You can see in many ways by the outcomes that it produces. So that difference between stated goals and inherent goals, unstated goals that everyone's just going along with, is really important to unearth and challenge and change in order for the system to change. And then we get to mindsets and paradigm shifts. Let's shift to the next slide around mindsets. So when we're talking about mindsets, it's really about, beliefs and belief systems that underlie everything else that happens in the system. Those rules, who has access to what information when, who's rewarded or punished for what, those are all based on the mindsets that are foundational to the system and the people who created the system and keep it going. And here we're talking about both individual mindsets and organizationally. Do we have awareness of the mindsets that are inherent to our systems? So to change the system and focus on mindsets, you have to become more self-aware individually as a person within the system, but also grow the self-awareness of the organizations that you're connected with. It's also helpful to determine what do we want to be different in terms of the mindsets of the system? What are we aiming for? What is desired? And it could be that there are some mindsets that are present within the system that exist, but they are new. They are those weak signals within the system, and there may be few people who hold positional power who hold those mindsets, but they do exist. So how might those existing mindsets be amplified? Or it could be that there are new ideas and belief systems that folks are wanting to introduce to a system to articulate for the first time. And that's a lot of what we've talked about here of the language that we use. Sometimes there may be an idea that's percolating, but it hasn't been put forward overtly yet. And then in changing the system and focusing on mindsets, it's actively pattern spotting. It's looking to see how those mindsets are showing up in the system in the various aspects of it. What forms are those mindsets taking in the rules, in the regulations, in who gets funded for what, in who benefits economically from development? What are the mindsets that underlie how the system has been operating? Next slide. And then the last thing I want to get across here is another sort of theory underneath that umbrella of systems change. It's called complexity theory, but it's really about cultivation. It's the idea that there's no one person in a position of power who can say, we're going to change the system and then have it actually happen. That systems change is actually more like cultivation than it is direction. You can, once you know what you're aiming for, it's really about everyone embracing this work and seeding, nurturing, weeding, and harvesting within the system. Next slide, Angie. So what we mean here is that each of us has the opportunity to inspire people to engage in this. We all know people. We all can talk to people that we're connected to, that we're in relationship with, to say, hey, there's this idea that I heard that I think is really exciting. And you bring it into their world and into their work. This is about incorporating new people into the work, as well as new ideas and new ways of thinking. It's about nurturing too, so that those seeds aren't just sitting on top of dry land, but that the soil has been prepared, that there are supports and resources that have been put in place in anticipation of a seed being planted so that it will do well. There's the idea of rain, of regularly questioning the mindsets, beliefs, and assumptions that are going on in the system. It's the idea of shining a light on the efforts that have the desired impact of what we're looking for, maybe in small ways, but we want to, have that particular seed, that new plant do really well. So we let other people know about it. Weeding is creating space for potential. It's recognizing that there are people and aspects of the system and our regular actions and ways of doing things that are crowding out that change that we're trying to nurture. And we need to move those out of the way to create room. And then harvesting, that we're looking always at the outcomes of what we're doing. We're analyzing what we said we were planning to do and what it's actually producing. We celebrate the good efforts and where change is really starting to take root. And then we apply back what we've learned. And all of this, again, is everyone's work. And just as with overall systems thinking, none of this is linear. You have to be paying attention to all of these aspects in order for cultivation to actually happen. It doesn't mean that each one of us has to be focusing our efforts on every one of these aspects. But if we all look at this array of possibilities and see where our time and our talents and our connections can have significant impact, and if everyone else does the same, working toward these same ends, we together can cultivate the systems change that we're looking for. So I think that's the last of my slides to then turn it to you, Paul. Or Tabitha, I wasn't sure if you want to check in there, whatever you want to do.
Why don't we keep going? And
Yeah,
so
sounds
I
good.
think, yep. So Paul, we'll turn it over to you because I think that we're based on what you laid out, Mary Margaret, going to try to help weave together some of the key commonalities between some of the key projects of what we would call maybe people-centered development that's happening across the country. And then we'll go into some feedback from the group.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about this project in San Diego. Anyone who knows me well knows I talk about it all the time. So if you've heard this before, get a drink, take a break, whatever. But this is Market Creek Plaza in San Diego. It's in a neighborhood called the Diamond District. It's not the part of San Diego you go to the beach, to hang out. It's, it is a neighborhood that's incredibly diverse, and that was struggling with a lot of the things that we see in neighborhoods that have been disinvested in, that we've talked about all along. So maybe Angie, if you can go to the next slide. Right. Okay. So here we are. We are southeastern San Diego in the mid 1990s. There's some great key questions, that came from the community. Could residents of disinvested neighborhoods build income and assets while we're building their communities? And what would happen if residents had fundamental control over the revitalization of their communities? And those are really important. I mean, this gets to exactly what we're talking about. How do we center residents at the table to say what they want to do? And not only center, but do they have the power, the control of what happens next in terms of revitalization? So these are some pictures from the area that Market Creek Plaza got developed on. If you go to the next slide. Yeah, it was 20 acres. It had environmental issues forever. It was, this area was viewed as unbuildable, for all the reasons people throw out, and also was viewed as unbankable. There was an area that they call the four corners of death. So it's not something that we haven't heard, or things that we haven't heard, as how the market perceives, our communities, and says, we just can't work there. And they come up with all kinds of reasons why that's their issue. So we go to the next slide. Okay, so Market Creek is built on these two pillars of one, investment, the whole relationship, and you see, trust building, community building, participatory decision making, and the fact that the whole structure was really planned by a set of community design teams. One of my favorite quotes from this work and the book that Jennifer Vanica, who was in charge of the Jacobs Foundation, who supported this work, talks about, is that communities should be able to dream, design, and do. And that's what this work was really about, right? So we're dreaming about what we want to see. We're designing how we get there, and then we're implementing what that is. So, those are all critical. And the other part of that, if we go to the next slide, okay, so this is getting a little bit in the weeds, but the other part of that is that builds strength and trust to do other work. So I think the benefits of these structures we're talking about in centering community is it's not just, okay, how did they get to develop the shopping center and the housing and other things? It's also about, it brought the community together. It was fragmented. It addressed violence. It addressed, how do you do work across the board in community, not just about housing development or retail development. And that's really important tool, because once you can come together as a community, you can achieve something and you can see that it works. You can apply that ability to all kinds of other systems change and all kinds of other things you want to get done, right? And you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. So from a asset and an ownership structure, and this was in 2006. So this is before crowdsourcing. This is before we really talked about wealth building and ownership structure. So this is really, this was really innovation in terms of how do we get this done. So, there was an individual benefit, community benefit, future benefit. So we got Diamond community investors. So those are community residents. We had they have a neighborhood unity foundation, and that was really building a structure to do other work in the neighborhood that could benefit from this work. And then there was the Jacobs Neighborhood Initiative. So you could see kind of ownership structure, and the plan is to buy out Jacobs. But this is also about how philanthropy can participate in a project in a different way. So we go to the next slide. Is there another slide? I don't remember. Must be. Okay, so then you can see kind of this waterfall effect from the profits, who gets paid first. It's really important that you can see that the community gets paid first. And I think to get people to say you should invest and that you're going to get a benefit, well then, you've got to see your return first, or else you're like, why do I do this? Then to the Unity Foundation, and then third to Jacobs and other investors. But I think that's a really important slide and really critical in these kind of structures. Because community benefit, and someone was saying earlier about, well, maybe I just need money right now. So getting people to invest means I have to see return. Next slide. Okay, a whole lot of numbers from my brain, but this is really just kind of gives you an idea of how the investment worked. You can see that, Diamond Community Investors invested 20%. And if you think about that, $500,000 coming out of a neighborhood, and we're not talking about, a rich neighborhood, is really substantial. I mean, that is really important, that people believed enough in this, they'd worked through this, that they were able to raise $500,000. And this is from a lot of individual investors. This is, and so that's critical, because that really is about, that's equity, that's the financial equity, but that's also the stake in what happens, as opposed to someone just shows up and says, we're going to do this development for you. And, we do it, and then it's like, okay, so what? So the whole, that structure, the debt structure, the PRI, this is kind of simplified because I know there's a bunch more, there's new market tax credits in here, but it's a $23 million project. So it's not small, it's significant here. And, you've got a $500,000 investment from the community. So next. So you can see the IPO sold out, 419 investors. It's 40% community owned. They have this Diamond Community Investment Trust. And what this did also is push them to think about how this one project on the 20 acres could, the process and strategy, expand to more work in their community. So, there is 52 acres identified by residents and site. And then they created a community development real estate investment trust. So continuing to use, and I think it's also about continuing to use the same, what's the word I'm looking for, vehicles and processes that we use in the private market, but use them in a way that are equitable. So we don't necessarily have to always create something new. We can use what's here already, but if we apply it in a different way, and I talked the other day about capital stacks, but like this is how we use these real estate tools in an equitable fashion to get the kind of results that we want to have. Can we go to the next slide? So here's just some pictures of what made the biggest difference. Site control, being intentional about long-term community control of assets. I think that's really important. Creating a civic infrastructure for linking and leveraging action. So how do you, that civic piece, people, using teams for connecting and coordinating people and decisions. So there was a lot of teamwork and team building, having a simple, clear, consistent process that people could trust. I mean, I think that is like so important. Most of the time we go in a room, first of all, the process isn't simple. It's not clear. It moves around depending on who's in power or what they need to do. And you don't build any trust when you do that. So if I can't easily say, okay, I get this, same thing happens all the time. And when you say you're going to do X, Y, Z, you do X, Y, Z. Yeah. And then being willing to risk actions with dynamic learning agenda. So how do you push the agenda? And you have to take risk and you have to push. So there's a picture. And so Market Creek is retail, entertainment, housing. It's actually really a cool place. I've been there. And so one of the things that, its whole design is really culturally inspired in terms of the communities that live in the Diamond District. How it's managed and marketed is really driven by community. And it's really become, this incredible source of pride for the community in terms of what they can do and how that can make a greater impact. So in terms of, for me, a lot of the work that we're talking about, this is one of my go-tos, and also because it's been around long enough that also we can take lessons from it. And I think that's the other piece. We can learn some things that worked here and some things that didn't work here well. And the fact that Market Creek is really willing to share what those lessons are, particularly on the retail side where they, how we all know how challenging retail is, right? And so they've had some significant challenges on the retail side, even with the Jacobs Foundation supporting community businesses in terms of rent and paying 2/3 of their rent. And, so it was a learning on, okay, how challenging it is to do that, and the constant need to think about how do we not have a bunch of nationally known chains because they can afford to make this work, but at the same time, supporting BIPOC businesses to do that work is also a challenge. And is that the last slide? Yep, that is the last slide. So for me, I think Market Creek really is merging what Mary Margaret talked about on the systems change and that process, along with how we can do that, how that manifests itself in a physically built project that's a development project.
Thank you, Paul. So we covered a lot of ground, and I think that, again, that was another example, maybe Paul's favorite example of manifested hope, right? Because that's kind of what we did last week, was provided examples across the country of people doing things differently to support equitable development in their community. And the couple things that I would just want to lift up before I ask you each to think about as we approach the how of equitable development and people-centered design, the question is going to really be around what are we going to need to be on the lookout for, be mindful of, that could get in the way of our trajectory and our progress. So just kind of keep that in mind in terms of that's the question. But there's a lot that can be said about what Paul shared with respect to the Market Creek example that we see in our own backyards. And when I say our own backyards, I'm going to speak for as my Powderhorn hat on, in terms of places like the Mercado Central or the Midtown Global Market, or institutions like the Metropolitan Consortium of Community Developers, or NDC, or Seward Redesign. You know what, projects like that, where we are trying to take a different frame and approach to centering what the community wants, are not easy, even though we are encouraged when we see them happen. They take decades and dozens, if not hundreds of people believing in the missional intent of what that project, that place, that resource represents. And again, when I think about the Midtown Global Market, they are so sold out, and I don't say this just because I'm a board member, but if anybody see Mike Tamale or Renee Dossman, let them know I'm out here in the streets representing, that they truly are committed to the idea that they are going to help to support and shepherd space that's accessible for culturally specific business owners, entrepreneurs who are not necessarily established, who are in the incubation, if not emerging phase. And we know that when you're in those phases, you don't often have access to a lot of capital. in order to do the thing that you within your business plan or in your heart believe that you've been called to do. And so it's intentional. It's a lot of sometimes what Paul pointed out in the Market Creek example, what we would call third-party support. So not always being captured from a transactional perspective in terms of cost per square foot in the real estate world from a commercial real estate perspective. So all of that is needed. So I spend a little time naming those things because I would be remiss if anyone left our sessions of History, Hurdles, and Hope thinking that we think that this is easy, or thinking that just naming one or two projects, then that's the silver bullet. It's so much more than that. And we know that as much as we are trying to center this idea of how do we keep the people at the center, but we know that they keep the projects and the efforts and the initiatives in the community only are able to get to the next level because of people. So not only centering people, but the energy, the goodwill, the tenacity, right? The dedication of people is a part of the how, meaning knowing good people, supporting good people. There's generally not a lot of places you have to look outside of our community to find a group, an institution, or an individual that you would want to support with your time or your dollars. So there's a lot of people up to a lot of good work, a lot of good trouble in Greater Powderhorn and Powderhorn specifically. So with that, the question for the group is really about, so what's going to get in the way of our good trouble? What's going to get in the way and the challenges and the opportunities that we're going to come up against as we're trying to build this shared narrative of the how to accelerating equitable development? What should we be trying to be of encouragement to one another to keep an eye out for? And if you have thoughts on how we navigate it, please do share. So you can, again, drop that in the chat, or if you want to come off mute and share some thoughts, something food for thought for us to consider, that would be great.
So I can real quick chime in here. As I've been listening today, the overarching theme seems to be about trust, and both restoring and building trust, in order to get these sort of projects done. Like I've heard sort of again and again that this can be like a barrier to coming together to get things done. And, as Paul mentioned earlier, like you can walk into a room and someone was like, well, why don't you trust me? Well, the reason is that like that trust has to be earned. So, like the first step, of course, being that we gotta build this kind of trust. And, as with I forgot the name of it, the last project that we were just talking about here, like one really good successful project can do a world of good in terms of creating that trust. And then, both people on both, or I should say both groups on both sides of it are looking at it and going, well, I know that this is a thing we can do. We can, this can achieve everybody's goals. This can be really great for the community. And so, like speaking to some of the questions that Tabitha had to sort of round this out a little bit is like, well, what do we need to watch out for is actions on really anybody's part that is going to serve to divide, or that will serve to breach that trust, or create, additional hurdles to having that trust. Certainly in the last 2 years, especially since the heinous murder of George Floyd, there have been a lot of things where our city, especially, I'd say, has breached the trust of a lot of our communities locally. And so, unfortunately, I feel like that means working with the city is going to create additional challenges to getting a lot of this stuff done, even though we do need to be able to work with the city in one way or another. So certainly our elections this past year didn't serve to do a lot of healing in that regard. I don't think that there was any kind of anything that we did, or I should say any changeovers in the last elections that might have moved that ball forward, not to get political, but I'm sort of come to the end of my thought because I don't know exactly how much further to get into it. Go ahead.
I would like to pick up on your thought, and I think it's a great
Please
foundation. This is Shannon Lemon, not on camera, but listening intently. And, picking up on that, I think big hurdles include believing that there's only one solution and that it's a work of a few. And I think, Paul, you've described this, we've heard it from many of us participating. It's complex and integrated, and it's all of our work. And if we allow the conversation to focus on a few solutions, celebrating a few investments, a few wins, and if we charge a few groups or a few people to do the work, then we lose. And so I think we have to create an umbrella of expectation that to change systemic issues, it has to be broad and encompassing, and there's no one investment or one group that is going to get it done. And a way to hold everyone accountable in terms of setting standards for success for the built environment, which I think is what we're working towards, I think will be huge, because the conversation can be, how have I contributed to these factors that we know are critical to creating communities where people feel a sense of belonging and can thrive and own not just the creation, but the equity and the outcomes of the investment. So those two things I think are hurdles.
Excellent. Thank you both. Way to lift up that what we need to be on the lookout for is the narrative that this isn't everybody's work. And so that is easy to fall into. One of the things I want to lift up is what Russ dropped in the chat, as he's wont to do, and appreciate it. So just he says that we need to recognize that public subsidies will need to be, are needed to use alternative asset building models, at least to get them off the ground. And the one thing that I would name is, yes, we need to be on the lookout for what is needed from public and private partnerships. But what was wonderful in part about some of the things that Paul shared last week is that we live in a country that luckily is accustomed to subsidizing who they want to subsidize. And so again, the Homestead Act of 1862, where again, as a reminder, over 270 million acres of land in this country was made available to a chosen few based on, how they were seen as probably whole citizens in this country. So definitely, that's not to say because they've done it in the past, it'll be easy. Let's just make people to understand the history and bada boom, bada bang, we're off to the races. But it is something to say that we can be sometimes, I think, steadied by the fact that the things that we're often naming are not unicorns. They're not unique. We've done them in the past, but for different reasons and for different people. And that's something to be on the lookout for, is when people say, well, this is so new, we can say, not so fast. It's not so new. What else comes to mind for folks in terms of what when we're thinking about the how of equitable development, centering people as opposed to transactions, starting from a place of healing and not just in name only, but in practice, knowing it when we see it, supporting it, and then understanding that systems change, the work thereof is not intended to be mathematical, but it can be very structured and what's needed to see it unfold in our communities. What comes up for you are things that we might need to keep in mind as we try to build out what our how looks like. Anything might worry people or keep you up at night? Ephraim, I see you came off mute.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to emphasize that I think all these great big projects are important and the way of the future. But I think a lot of things can happen on the smaller Creative Commons, like in people's backyards, in the parks that we're so graced to have. smaller business storefronts like mine and Kara's. And I just think that, the work has already begun and started, and we don't have to wait. Like what happened at Robert's Shoes this summer, every weekend they were having programming, and I see that as healing, community coming together, connection, expression, food, health, vitality. All these things are, I think, paramount. So I wanted to just remind everybody that we have what we need right now. We don't have to wait for the big projects, even though that's going to be amazing. 10, 15 years from now, maybe 5. But we can think outside the box, just like transit and transportation, with internet and everything has changed so much in the last 5 years. We can change the way the social commons works, like we're doing right now. Can you imagine this 2 years ago, even, or 3 years, I guess? I've been on probably more Zoom meetings than like one on average a day or something like that. But like it's kind of a necessity at this time.
Thank you, Ephraim. And just want to lift up what I'm seeing, Cara, that you placed in the chat. Definitely agree. Available does not mean easy, does not mean right. The comment was more in the spirit of, our country has acted in the past with malicious intent, with genocidal intent, with homicidal tendencies. And so we do not need to let the idea of what a group of leaders, elected or otherwise, aren't comfortable with doing now, blind us from what we've been willing to do in the past for much more heinous reasons. Other thoughts in terms of, Richard, I think I see your hand, I'm sorry.
Yeah, just two thoughts of kind of things to do. And both of them come from the 21st century development work. One was, what does a process look like where neighborhoods create goals for their neighborhood ahead of development so that you're ready and empowered to have that conversation before it kind of blips through project-based? Because I don't think these are often project-based conversations that shouldn't be project-based conversations. So that's one idea. Another idea that we embedded in there was this idea that you have to change the way design teams are structured. Design teams always bring expertise in, structural engineers, call whatever. And so we said community organizers ought to be an expertise that you bring in, because generally you suck at engaging communities. But that was like a blip of a thought that doesn't really have shape to it. That would be, I think, some interesting conversations with people who are really good at engaging communities of what would that look like? What are the skill sets community organizers would do on design teams? To then have future conversations of trying to figure out how to execute it in some way. Because I think there's some there as a power of an idea to really help have a better process by which we do things. But quite frankly, it was here's a good idea that we maybe have 1% of the idea and we need the other 99% of the idea there.
Yeah. No, I think that's great, Richard. And I think that one of the things, as we will find, and as we begin to pivot kind of to the next movement, but then ultimately the next steps, even beyond the workshop series, is just understanding that there are so many different paths that we can all take. And then when it comes to our agenda, or the community's agenda, needing to narrow in on what can we do together, where do we start? And that's never to knock ideas of what could make impact, but the question will always probably be, what do we prioritize? And so there's sometimes the difference between how do we either continue to support processes and approaches that are happening, again, within that transactional space, versus putting energy into development that is happening based on the wellness needs in community, right? So even from an activating, organizing, and helping institutions do engagement better, I think that is valid and valuable. And yet we will need to, as community, determine what is, again, the points of pressure that will provide the most lift to what we're trying to see experienced. which right now there's often a significantly more deficit between resources. We just saw the one project, which I know that we can all attest to, most significant corridor or large scale development initiatives. And to be fair to what Ephraim said, we don't have to wait on the $23 million projects, but so many projects that even result in the redevelopment or rehab or new construction are multi-million-dollar projects. Multi-million-dollar projects, and oftentimes those are the ones that are less inclined to leverage the vision and the voice and centering the health needs of community into their creation. So with that,
Oh, I guess I just wanted to add a little bit from what you're saying, Tabitha, is that for many of the developers here, I want to actually, well, I met someone who is working here for the East North Minneapolis, or not North Minneapolis, but the East development that focuses on downtown Minneapolis, and there's an event going on February with the city. But I want to just bring awareness of the environmental perspective of all of these projects and how, not having access, you look at people in Minnetonka and all the parks, or just access to trees and creeks or whatever. And then you look at people that are living in like South Minneapolis, for example, there's not, well, maybe, depends where you are, there's not a lot of access to, trees and just nature. And that's something that, should be a huge, something to think and, just who has access to this, and obviously the impact for climate.
great. Thank you again, Gladys. I think that's, again, another example of sometimes what processes don't allow enough time for, or learned behaviors don't allow enough time for. Wanting to acknowledge too what I saw Gretchen drop in the chat, certainly supporting the inroads that Richard is making in terms of how design starts, and that thinking is so essential in terms of having allyship and partners who have more direct ties to development, or traditional, I would say, development, but then also providing a resource, a link to how LISC, so Local Initiative Support Corporation, is supporting different approaches to development. Thank you, Dara. So thank you for being with us. I see that she had to jump. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Paul. And this is really the last movement that we have, everyone, in terms of kind of where do we go with the how, and what are we going to almost kind of center. And this is kind of about us having a little bit of a reflection and some thoughts around all the things that has brought so many of us together in the past 2 years, certainly in unfortunate response to the heinous murder of Mr. Floyd. So Paul, why don't you take it from here?
Okay, thank you. So as Tabitha said, this response to the murder of George Floyd, and I would add COVID, right, has exposed the fact that the way our society operates is not equitable. And COVID really put out there that, okay, if you work in the grocery store, you have to go to work every day. And if I'm working for the Minneapolis Parks Foundation, I could sit in my house and be safe and do Zoom. And these inequities are front and center and staring everyone in the face in terms of how our country works economically, socially, culturally. And these are coming together. Locally, as everyone has said, we have a lot of great things that are going on. And people talked about Juxta and the Cultural Wellness Center and everything that's gone on, and all kinds of great work is happening. Some of that work, and particularly as we're at now, are we reacting to these terrible things? And shouldn't we be operating this way all the time? Not because we have these crises. Now, we had the crises, so how do we make sure that what comes out of this doesn't stay the same? That we don't just get tired of talking about it, and as time goes on, our attention span wanes and we go back to business as usual. And what I'm most interested in and what I push a lot is, how do we get this collective impact? Because we all acknowledge, yeah, people are doing great work everywhere. And there are smaller projects, there are larger projects, and there are things going on. They tend to be disconnected. And it's really hard to keep up with who's doing what, where, when, why, and how, and what's the structure to leverage all that good work so that, I know what Russ is doing and where he's pushing on the city. And therefore, if I'm in the room talking, I can mention that too. I can help push. And how do we get to the point where that our systems change, is that, we don't have to keep talking about this because, in my career, I'm getting old. I've been working out here for 30 years. We keep having this same conversation. We call it different things, right? But the reality is it's the same conversation that we've been having, right? And so if we're going to have the change that we want to see, then, we have to get focused on, okay, we're not all separate, right? And that, the work I'm doing on the north side, is connected to the work someone's doing on the south side, and that we can find a way to be connected and drive the bigger change that we're all looking for. I think some of the, for me, some of the examples I tried to give were things that were driving towards those bigger overall changes. And one of the projects from Reimagining the Civic Commons is in Akron, where their work actually impacted a division in the city. So basically, they went from separate planning, housing, and economic development, divisions to one unified one, because they saw through this work that, wow, we're all working in silos and that's not working. It doesn't serve the community well. So I'm reading it. I'm sorry. I'm reading I'm reading the chat and not talking. So, for me, yeah, collaboration is critical. And we also have to remember that these systems we're talking about, cross all the boundaries. So I have to work, if I'm doing a project, I have to work with the same systems that other people are working with. It's not any different. A lot of the same people, a lot of the same institutions, a lot of the same ways you get money, get zoning, do whatever, but they're all the same. So we're all talking to these people. A lot of times we're all saying the same things, but we're all talking to them separately. And we're all talking about our piece and not the greater whole. And what we're looking for is, how do the pieces are greater than the sum, right? So all this work needs to drive a much bigger outcome. And I believe in order to drive that much bigger outcome, we have to find a way to be more interconnected and more closely aligned, and that may be some way to manage a lot of that work. Because if you're doing a project, it's hard. You're focused on, how do I get this done? How do I get whatever I need? How do I connect with community? Like all those things. And you're probably not paying as much attention to other things going on outside of you. However, those other things are impacting how you get your work done. So I believe that we need to do that to get the kind of change. And that goes back to my also nationally, that is also going on. So there's a lot of great work going on locally and nationally, and like collectively, how does that drive how we get to the kind of change we want to see here in the Twin Cities, which is unique from our progressiveness and, what we see as, when people look at it, the Great Kite Festival that Taylor was talking about, all these wonderful things, and people go, oh, look, it looks so wonderful there. Until you peel that little veneer back and get to like, wow, look at those terrible disparities, right? And how do we leverage the resources that are here to make that change? Because they're all here in this place. Like, I like to look outside for what's going on somewhere else that I can contextualize, but we have everything we need right here in Minneapolis and in this region to make this change. you know, I appreciate too Richard's comment about designers and architects. In my work, my pet peeve is architects should be way better at engaging community. And so I'm pushing at the industry level and the school level that, yeah, that's a skill set you really need to have if you want to do this work. And yes, there are organizers who are way better, but you should be facile enough and understand enough that, you know, you can work together. Because when you outsource it, you get kind of this bifurcation. And then you're like, oh, okay, that's what so-and-so said, that's what the community said, but I don't really understand why, or I have no connection. And then I'm just supposed to go over here and design something. So we still have that kind of separation going on, and we don't have the community driving the whole process from beginning to end. And I think that's really important. You know, engagement isn't a 3-month process at the beginning of the project. It's the totality, right? So that's all kinds of things happen once I go to design. And I'm asking all kinds of questions and doing all kinds of things, and developers are doing all kinds of things. And if community's not at the table and not part of those conversations, then you wonder, well, how did this happen? Why does it look this way? Or why did this fall out? Or whatever, right? And I think that's really important to do that work. So for me, the hope of this session is that we won't keep having these in isolation, and that also down the road, we won't have to have this discussion about why isn't this working, but it will become how we do the work, right? Just like we do development in ways that are standard, right? You know, if you're going to build something, there are things you just do because this is the way it goes, right? I want to get to the point where we do this way because it's the way we do the work, not because it's special, it's outside of how we typically operate, and I have to fight for it all the time.
Okay, great, Paul. Just always trying to check for the pause. But thank you. And again, so some of that we're hoping that you can help us to better understand from your view and your lens is, how has the past 2 years felt to you in terms of things that you are aware of that is focused on trying to support equitable development in our community? You know, we use some of the language around a little bit fragmented as what it comes up, and just wondering, what are other people sensing, feeling about the various projects, initiatives, intentions that's happening? Because again, before we start moving down the path of trying to solve or bring more of the work that we're all trying to do, not under one awning, but to have a deeper or more collective impact, right, toward our aims. Just wondering if others see it differently, or others sensing something other than a lot of great work, but that doesn't seem to be very well knit together. Thoughts, reactions?
I would say that the work is there. I mean, thank God that there are people that care. But at the end of the day, the people that are in these seats on the table, or the leadership just itself, they're not people that they're serving. They're not bringing people in with those skills. And it's not that there are not Black and brown developers out there, or engineers or architects. And if they're not, why aren't we creating these spaces, or why aren't we taking the time to teach these individuals so they can be in the table? You know what I mean? That's kind of the only thing that, even, you know, right now with this website that Gretchen sent, I'm looking at the organization and reading a little bit. It's amazing, but everyone that's on the board is white, every single person there. And when I look at the advisory individuals, I mean, not that, you know, names are names, but when I look at the staff, even, it's just a problem. I mean, I got fired from a job where the leadership team was white, and they were getting information from brown and Black individuals. So I got fired for, you know, for being a change maker, what my title was. And I feel like change is not going to be made when these individuals continue to be the ones, you know, just keeping with the system in a way. You know, systems don't change because you're just used to that stuff.
Thank you, Gladys. So I'm going to recognize Gretchen and also just to acknowledge the group was the idea of more diversity across varying roles within institutions. And I also understand, and we all know that that's not easy, given one of the things that, if you remember, Sam said on the day one, is that oftentimes the race has been so long ran a particular way that getting the visible reflection of diversity at tables is real work. It is part of the work that we all have to do. Gretchen, you had something?
Well, I haven't been on our website lately, so I don't know how up to date it is, but I just wanted to say 40% of our board are people of color, and both the chair and co-chair are people of color. So, you know, the perception that some of these more established organizations are just white people is not necessarily accurate. And I apologize if our website is outdated. But I think well, I would just suggest that there are a variety of organizations that are working to correct for that diversity challenge. So just wanted to mention that.
Thanks, Gretchen. I think that that's important and that's great. And I think that that's meaningful. And yet, even as we know that within changing board leadership and leadership, you know, I think that I don't want us to lose the thread that it's all interrelated between, even when we're hiring differently and putting people in different roles, process, procedures, and policies also are areas that need work in order for persons who are diverse with diverse experience and ideas, for that to be able to change the direction of an institution. But that's not to say I don't think that LISC is not. That's just to say, yes, increasing cultural diversity is important, and also all the other things in terms of systems and processes that are so, again, grafted into a lot of the ways that we sometimes approach not only development, but community building and so much more. Russ, you had a few thoughts?
How did you know I had a few thoughts?
I'm going with the hand. I'm going with the hand.
You know, first of all, I just want to validate what Gladys said. It's really important. And I, being a white male who was an executive director of an organization for over 24 years, that went along the racial equity journey and was challenged many times, I knew that we were never going to be seen as authentically led by people of color as long as there was a white director. No matter what kind of leadership we seated to our board, which very early on became 70%, then 80% people of color. Staff was usually about 50% or a little more color. It's part of a journey, especially for an established white organization. And so when I hear a challenge like Gladys's, and I hear her story that she got fired for being a change maker, literally in her job title, you know, I just think that makes me pause, and it's sad that we're hearing that story, right? It's really discouraging because in the last 2 years, there's been a tremendous amount of rhetoric among institutions, recognizing that they need to change, that we've had this racial reckoning in Minneapolis, forget about the rest of the country. And we're still questioning whether that's really happening. So without getting into the particulars of one organization or another, I just wanted to say that I originally wanted to jump on what Gladys had said about green space and natural areas and their healing value. It's funny because, you know, at the Lake Street Council, I find myself saying, where are we going to see the opportunities to green up Lake Street a little more? Just think about Lake Street, right? It's a vital commercial corridor. It's a great place for incubating new businesses. There's so many challenges. But when you think of Lake Street, you don't think of like tree-lined street, right? And we know that tree canopy is really important to offsetting the heat island effects of global warming. We know our summers are going to get hotter. If you've gone to any number of places, you'll see amazing developments that did not limit their budget on the landscaping, right? If you think about some of the most amazing places you've ever traveled to, shopped, and particularly in other countries, they do such a better job in this than Americans. You'll see that they incorporate nature into as an element in the shopping experience. And those are some of the more, I think, successful shopping experiences in a lot of ways. The last thing I'll say is, it's funny, I was on a different call focused on Lake Street, where they started bringing up examples that Paul had already brought up with us. And somebody had put in a link to the Upper Harbor Terminal. I think one of the challenges we're going to have is, if we're going to do something revolutionary that breaks the mold, it is going to be piecemeal. It's going to be project by project. And an earlier person had said it's got to be much more widespread. It has to be an institutional change in our practice. And unfortunately, I can't think of a way for us to make those first steps beyond this project, and that, and then lifting those up and saying, this is how we should do development all the time here, right? And maybe the table is set for us to say, absolutely change your priorities, change the way we approach this, change regulation, and do this differently from now on. We may be there. I don't know when we will be there. Paul might have a better sense of that than I. But Upper Harbor Terminal was, publicly controlled. Think about that. Park Board, City of Minneapolis, site control. Where else do we think we have that? We have that at the Kmart site on Lake Street, right? And that's, I don't know how many acres that is, but it's probably similar to the 20 acres of Market Creek, I would think. I'm not good at the eyeballing it, but it's, it's city controlled, folks. Like, we could do anything we want there if we have the organizing and the power and all that. So good things can happen when you have site control. I guess that's the last point.
Thank you, Russ. So we're at 2:17. We end today at 2:30. I do just want to honor everyone's time as best we can. I think there's again, what we always realize, and I hope a lot of times when we come together as community partners and leaders and supporters and champions, is that we could have a lot more dialogue. We need to have a lot more dialogue. Our hope and our commitment is that we continue to find ways to do this, and not just within this circle, as has been a challenge that Shanae has brought forward at different points in the conversation, and others. So please bear with us as we work to play a role, right, as a convener, and how do we continue to lift up not only what we know to be one pathway for increasing equitable development, but then also what does our hyper local communities, just like what Russ was saying in terms of where can we make inroads, how do we continue to bring visibility, champion that, and resources and support? Because one thing I would name is that it is important for us to collaborate. I think it makes all the difference in the world when we're trying to strive for examples of things, whether it be Upper Harbor Terminal or the Kmart site or Market Creek or the Coliseum building of sewer redesign or the US Bank or what NDC is at the corner of Chicago and Lake. On and on and on, we can name these things. And yet the collaboration that it takes is often unfunded. We have a lot of unfunded mandates to figure out the health in our community, to stay at tables for years, to collaborate for years, and the posture of trying to make things better, of which then it only leads to another form of trauma, exhaustion. It erodes often what we are saying we're about, which is the passion and the commitment to do our part, not all the parts, but our part in furthering equitable development. So all that to say is we have our work ahead of us. We hope that we can do all the things, which is champion what's working, continue to find ways to further new bodies of work by thinking differently and supporting new pathways to invest in our communities, while also providing the right amount of support to the organizations that are convening, collaborating, and working together for these aims. I'm now going to turn it back over to Paul for some words of appreciation, and then Mary Margaret will round us out for the day with helping us to understand what you can expect next in the weeks ahead as kind of what we would consider to be phase 2 and 3 of our partnership in this space.
Thank you, Tabitha. So first, I'd like to thank everyone who's come out and spent time here. I mean, time is precious, and for you to come out, most of you for the 3 days and spend this amount of time with us is really important. So I want to thank you all for that, and how you've interacted with us. And, as I've gone through this, I've taken a lot from what I've heard, which I think is the way we want the process to be, right? So I've been able to incorporate feedback, think about it, get perspective. So for me, this has been a joy because, not only did I get to talk about the things that I love, and, I wouldn't be here if I still didn't have hope, but I also get to hear from people who are working on this from different perspectives and hear what they're doing and think about how that impacts the work and the way I'm thinking about it. So a learning experience for me. I hope one for you, and that you go away from here, with hope and determination for how we can make this change. Pause, Mary Margaret.
The audible pause. All right. So next steps. As we've teed up a few times in this, the immediate next step is that we're actually going to be reaching out to each of you to schedule a one-on-one interview and go deeper into some of the things that you've teed up here. We've tried to take good notes for the sort of seeds that you've planted along the way of particular ideas or organizations that you're part of or frustrations that you've had, and to understand better the nuances and details of the things you've raised, and give you an opportunity to talk more expansively or more deeply about the hurdles that you've faced, the bright spots that you've seen, and maybe as well about how some of the history that Paul teed up or your own experience has shaped what you think is possible here, and how it can inform how we move forward together. Those interviews will be organized, the questions developed based on all that we've heard from you over the next couple of weeks, and we will invite you to schedule time with an interviewer, most likely to be in late February. So over the next couple of weeks, we want to form this. We will reach out to you to get a time on your calendar that works for you. We'll try to be really flexible with that time, to be nights and weekends if need be. Just understanding that you all have different schedules and times that work for you. The other ask that I have related to the interviews is, if there's someone who you really think has some important insights into what we've been talking about here, and can be a further contributor to the change agenda that we're looking to draft, send a note to Christina at PPNA of who that person is, and how, if you've got contact information of how to reach them, even better. There are some folks that are really hard to find. A lot of websites just have forms now where you can't actually connect with a person. Totally get it, but it does make it hard. And a personal connection there is also really helpful, where we're able to say, hey, Gladys or Ephraim or Kim suggested that we reach out to you to get some one-on-one time and hear your perspectives. So we expect we'll close out those interviews by the end of February, and then in March, really try to bring together all that we've heard into a draft multi-sector change agenda to share back with all of you. So anticipate that sometime in March is likely when the rough draft of that would be shared through a reconvening of those who participated. And so that really moves us into a phase where we would finalize, or I should say, we would get that agenda to a point where it's less of a rough draft, more of a 90% draft, and get it out to the broader community through community meetings and multimedia, and have folks weigh in and share further their experiences and help and refine that further. And then it becomes more of a mobilization effort. Paul mentioned earlier that the collaboration that it takes to do this work is often unfunded. we have funding that helps with this work through that phase of developing those communications messages and materials. When it gets to a broader campaign for change, that's the stuff that's not yet funded. And so we've got to figure out how we make that work. We repurposed at AI Minnesota 2 grants that we had from the McKnight Foundation and the Minneapolis Foundation to support this work. And I'm grateful that they did so not knowing what this work was going to be, really just said, we want to redirect it toward supporting something new and different to happen in these areas affected in the unrest. My hope is that they will continue on with us, but frankly, as we shift into more of an advocacy realm, we know that there are also some barriers there in terms of what grant making organizations can actually fund, and where they have a bright line related to advocacy. So those are the steps that we have in mind. That's the general time frame of where we're at. Does anyone have any questions about those logistics? Any advice or concerns as we get ready to go into this phase of one-on-one interviews and then pulling together a draft and sharing it back with you all? One thing I should note with the one-on interviews, those also could be 2-on-1. If you're less comfortable, oh, that's a nice freeze of my face. I'm gonna turn that off. Hopefully you can still hear me. Good. It may be more comfortable for you to be joined by someone else in that conversation. If you're less comfortable with a one-on-one and you'd rather have a 2-on-1, just let us know. So we're eager to go more deeply in learning each of your perspectives and bringing this all together in something for you to respond to and help to further shape. All right. I'm not seeing more questions on that. If you do end up having questions after the fact, feel free to reach out to Christina or Tabitha or me or Paul, and we'll continue to move this forward. I just want to thank all of you again for being here with us. We're at 2:28, so I'm not giving you a lot of time back in your day, but 2 minutes is 2 minutes. So we'll take it, right? Thank you again, and we will be in touch very soon.